Welcome to Too Complicated for History. I am Isaac S. Loftus, and I am joined by my co-host, Dr. Lynn Price Robbins, where twice a month we bring you the history that has fallen through the cracks of your curriculum. Today, we've got a particularly special episode, and before we get into the interview, I wanted to share what I think was one of the first transcendent moments that I ever had while playing a video game. I was in college and I was playing a game called Red Dead Redemption. And there is a mission where you ride on a horse to Mexico for the first time. And the sun was setting because the game had dynamic daytime and nighttime when I was doing this. And a song starts playing. I think it's called Far Away by Jose Gonzalez. And genuinely, for the way video games had started when I was young and where this took by the time I was in college, I had never been transported into a moment in a place and a time in history so much as that. And looking out across that Western landscape with the song playing and the sun setting in the background was really special. So with that in mind, I am incredibly excited to have today's guest. Our guest today is Dr. Tori Olsen. He is the Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies in History at the University of Tennessee. He's a specialist in post-Civil War U.S. history, and he's the author of the book Red Dead's History, A Video Game, An Obsession, and America's Violent Past, which is available today. Thank you, Dr. Olsen, for joining us.
Hey, thanks so much, Isaac. It's such a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to meet you, and Lynn, it's a pleasure to meet you as well. I'm really looking forward to our conversation together. And yeah, that's an iconic moment in Red Dead 1, that's for sure. Though I will say that the landscape you were looking out on when that song played was not Western, but Northern, because it's Northern Mexico by that point, right?
Oh, you're right. You're totally right. Yeah, it is northern Mexico. But yeah, I could see it on your face as I was talking that you recognized the moment that I'm talking
Great
about. And
moment.
I wanted to start with that for a couple of reasons. What connected me to the series, the game series, and growing up on the East Coast, I actually wasn't particularly interested in the American West until that video game. And then also, Lynn is admittedly not a video game player. What was the
I have
last video
nothing
game you played,
against
Lynn?
them. I growing up, we never had video game consoles, and I've played Pac-Man. And I think that's
Sure.
there's probably listeners who have no idea what that even is, or they're like, I saw that in an antique store, but
Yeah.
that's all I played.
So I wanted to start with the story about what like the potential emotional connection with video and like and how complex they have been, just to sort of set the stage for the kind of conversation that we're going to have, and because your book dives into the history behind all of this, sort of that lays the groundwork for this story. And Lynn, you had some questions. You were particularly curious
Well,
to
I
get started
mean,
with.
of course, the first thing I think of, because it's really difficult for me to watch historically based TV shows or movies, because I'm always thinking, well, that's not right. Oh, they didn't have that. What are you wearing? So how is this video game done as far as historical accuracy? I imagine the characters are made up, or are they actually historical figures? Do they do research on clothing? Sort of. And as a historian, I imagine this is something you notice pretty thoroughly as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, great question to start us off with. So first off, I'll say that, my book is not a history of the making of the Red Dead Redemption games. I
Right.
know
Hmm.
almost nothing about the creative process that Rockstar Games undertook to make these games. They're very private about their creative process, which is totally
Fair.
legitimate for a big developer like this. So this is not a history of the making of the game. So I'm really much
Hmm.
more interested in how these games um, can shed light on, the games are fictionalized, which I'll get into in just a minute, how the fictional content of the games can actually help shed light on the real, gritty, and often violent history of the United States in that turn of the century period. So, what am I talking about here? Well, first off, most of what I'm going to discuss in our conversation today, and which I foreground in the book, is the second Red Dead Redemption game, which is
Right.
came out in 2018. So it's a sequel to that wonderful first game that Isaac discussed in the opener here. Came out in 2018, and the game is set in 1899. Now the question, of course, is, well, how accurate is it? It's kind of an impossible question to answer in some ways because, as you gestured toward, the developers fictionalize the names of almost everything. right? So geographically, they're all made up regions. There is
Okay.
obviously no state of Lemoyne or West Elizabeth in the United States. And the names of just about every single person is made up as well. There is one
Okay.
exception. There's one institution that is not fictionalized, and that's the Pinkerton Detective
Oh,
Agency.
institution.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
I was
But
gonna say there's a person.
no, the names of all the people and places are made up, right? So, which is different from other big historically inflected games like the Assassin's Creed series, which uses
Right.
a lot of, actual France and, Baghdad and places like
Right.
that. So the Red Dead games are different in that sense. So how well did the developers do in trying to capture this moment in history, right? Because the very opening splash screen of the game says, it's set in America, 1899, with a particular interest in the West. Though, as I'm happy to talk about more later on, a lot of this game is not in the West. A lot of it's in the South. A lot of it's in the Caribbean, in Appalachia, places that we don't think of as Western at all. So in terms of what they get right, I think
Hmm.
aesthetically, like in terms of how things look, the sort of typefaces on the newspapers and the architecture of the buildings and the clothing, it's pretty good. It's
Nice.
surprisingly good given certainly competitors out there. And I think it's undeniable that the developers spent a lot of time studying visual artifacts from this period, photographs. Let's say New Orleans, for example. There's the biggest city in the game is called Saint Denis, and it's obviously supposed to be this New Orleans of 1899. And if you look at images from the Library of Congress website, photographs taken around the turn of the century in New Orleans, they look a whole lot like Saint Denis. There's just no denying that. They really nail the visual aesthetics of this place. They also get natural phenomena like mountains and agricultural crop fields, and there's a lot to praise in Red Dead Redemption 2. But
Nice.
we are historians too. We know that like a photograph does not communicate everything about a place. What about the sort of fabric of life? What about the cultural, social world, which of course a photograph can kind of gesture toward, but can't really capture. So I spent a lot of time in my book and in the class that inspired this book, which I'll talk about more later on, thinking about how well did the games capture the actual kind of social and economic and cultural reality of the U.S. At that time. And on this count, the
Hmm.
developers do a lot worse. It's much easier to recreate a photo than it is to recreate a society, a culture,
Right.
a way of life, and multiple competing ways of life, I should say. There's no unanimity in how people thought at the time. So I can get into details later on, but the sort of cultural fabric of the game is hit or miss, right? I'd say they probably miss slightly more often than they hit on that question.
This episode of Too Complicated for History is brought to you by our supporters over on Patreon. If you'd like to support the show and join the conversation, our membership is completely free. And that gives you access to our Discord, which is a place for like minded history fans and even some of the historians that we've interviewed to just chat, hang out, and ask interesting questions. Our paid tiers give you access to exclusive content, live streams, and even signed book giveaways. Check it out today at patreon.com/primary source media. That's patreon.com/primary source media. Pat should put it in a graphic right about here. Now let's get back to the show. There's a lot to unpack here, I think. So, like, in the fact that they're getting a lot wrong as far as the as a society as a whole, is there any particular place that you found more egregious than others, like where there was more liberty taken?
Yeah, well, let's just talk about two pink elephants in the room about stuff that's
Okay.
missing. There's two subjects that were of towering significance to Americans in 1899 and are
Mhm.
almost entirely absent in Red Dead Redemption 2. Like, it would be
Okay. Interesting.
unfathomable to consider American society without these two topics, but they're just not in the game. And they are the
Hmm.
labor movement and party politics.
Oh
Both of
gosh.
those are just completely absent. And so, obviously, the labor movement was making tremendous gains. It faced tremendous challenges at that moment in time, but it was kind of the social question of the day. Like, where do you stand on organized labor as an issue? And
Right.
there is, as far as I've gathered, one single reference in Red Dead Redemption 2 to unions, and it's like takes 15 seconds or so in the game. So clearly, it's not a subject of much significance there. And then there's a whole question of party politics. Arthur Morgan, the protagonist of the game, he does explicitly say, I don't care about politics, but anyone who votes is stupid, right? That would have been a really unrealistic view, especially for him to have, because he does have some pretty firm political views. He's pretty
Okay.
strongly anti-racist in the game. He's opposed to these systems of racial hierarchy that obviously existed, in which the game does showcase to some degree in the game. If he had firm views like that, which were not totally rare, but fairly uncommon among white men of his bracket, he would have been in politics. He probably would have been a
Sure.
Republican. I don't
Right.
know. He could have been a populist as well. But almost, I mean, we live in a moment today of incredible politicization and of partisan polarization. Well, that's also true of 1890s America, except the voter turnout rates are actually a good bit higher than they are today. So, like, everyone's political. Gunslingers were political. Jesse James
Mhm.
and Wild Bill Hickok, those were firmly political characters who like were affiliated with one party and generally hated people from the other party. And the fact that there's just no politics at all in Red Dead 2, it's understandable knowing that this developer wants to make a less controversial kind of, bipartisan product for people to enjoy, but it's completely bizarre historically.
Sure, but even him being having the racial opinions that he does is political by our own standards in
Exactly.
terms of his perception. By having him have a relatively rare opinion that kind of lines up with sort of the moral uh, um, tastes of our day. I mean, that's inherently, it's definitely a choice that they're making.
Right.
They didn't forget. I mean, especially because you said that, I mean, if the Pinkertons are the only real like organization that's in it, the fact that there is no labor mention of it is kind of interesting given the Pinkertons interaction
Right.
with labor
Yeah.
over
Well,
the
so
years.
the other big topic that the games get kind of half right and half wrong is the question of violence. And I think
Hmm.
it's undeniable that Red Dead Redemption 2 is a violent video game. Like so many other popular video games today, there's a whole lot of bodies that pile up along the storyline of this game. And what is that realistic? Is that accurate or not? Well, it is true that in the late 19th century, the United States is an unusually violent place. Not all of it, but certain pockets of it, especially certain pockets of the West,
Hmm.
certain pockets of the South and Appalachia, compared to other parts of the US at the time or compared to other moments in American history. So there is quite a bit of bloodshed going on at this moment. Of course, it's not the 900 bodies or so, which is like the minimum amount of people killed in Red Dead Redemption 2. Like, that's bizarre, obviously. There's no outlaws who are
Sure.
killing that number of people. But the US was violent. But the question is, why were people shooting each other?
Right.
What was fueling that violence? And in the games, the kinds of factors that fuel violence are generally personal or about grudges or rivalries or the individual
Hmm.
pursuit of wealth, right? Robberies, hijackings, this sort of
Hmm.
thing. The overabundance of whiskey, poker games, a lot of the similar sort of justifications behind violence that we see in traditional Western films, that Hollywood's produced for a long time. And
Sure.
of course, some of that too did fuel real violence in the United States of the 1890s. But most of the violence that took place in that period had to do with big social problems, had to do with major dilemmas in American culture and society that divided people. And what I really foreground in my book and in the class that inspired this book is that the two big drivers of violence were disputes about capitalism on one hand and about race on the other. In the
Hmm.
West, it was
Right.
primarily disputes about capitalism, though there's
Hmm.
some about race. And in the South, it's primarily disputes about race that drove violence, though there's some capitalism in there too, to be sure. In Appalachia is mainly a question of capitalism as well. So these are like, the big structural factors that prompted real violence. And the game, it gestures toward them a little bit, and it does more
Hmm.
than I expected to be honest. But it doesn't thread out the full, story of what was going on with those big social problems.
Right.
When you say capitalism and disputes about capitalism, what do you mean? Because
Yeah.
even just that phraseology
Hmm.
feels super foreign to a modern ear.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so, all of us have grown up around massive corporations that dominate our society and economy. The sort of
Hmm.
Walmarts and Amazons and Apples. They were there when we were born and they've just always existed. Right? We've kind of grown
Sure.
familiar, not necessarily comfortable, maybe some people have, not me personally, but we've grown familiar with the tremendous disparities in wealth that come out of this corporate capitalist regime. That was all new in the late 19th century. Like in the decades after the
Hmm.
Civil War, Americans are really confronting that for the first time. It's really the
Hmm.
railroads who are the first major megacorporations, and then comes things like Standard Oil and um, Rockefeller, U.S.
The
Steel. This
barons of the Gilded Age.
Exactly,
That's what you're
right?
Right.
So like
talking
corporate
about. Okay.
capitalism is new to people. And a
Right.
lot of Americans are not at all sure that they like this new regime that's coming into shape. But a lot of
Hmm.
them see it as a corruption of democracy, that it's like incompatible with actual a democratic system of politics. They also are very anxious that these, distant capitalist elites should have so much power in regular people's lives. In places like the West, in places like the South, and there's a huge amount of unrest and ultimately violence that results from that. I mean, talked about the labor movement previously. That's a classic example. Labor disputes would often get quite violent in the Gilded Age and Progressive era, and it was very often these, big dilemmas of capitalism that fueled it. So strikes
Hmm.
regarding railroads and meatpacking plants and all this would often get violent. And in the West, this was especially true when it came to things like the ranch wars, the sort of the Johnson County War of the 1890s, really disputes between big ranchers and small scale holders and cowboys. It's a question of rich and
Hmm.
poor, right? So in that sense, the divisions of industrial capitalism were really driving people to take their revolvers out of their holsters or their Winchesters to shoot people because it was a hugely divisive issue.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And I think one thing I want to perhaps step back a little bit, and because we keep saying the West, and I think, the American West has a meaning in sort of popular culture. I imagine it has a meaning not entirely correct for the game, and it has a meaning to historians who study the West. So, can you give us a little idea of when you say the West, what exactly you're referring to? What does that encompass?
Yeah, for sure. So when I say the West, I mean this is a big, broad blanket category. I use it to describe the land west of the Mississippi River. So that
Okay.
includes much of the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountains, the kind of arid southwestern regions, and the coasts on the Pacific as well. And of course, the game is never gives a precise definition of what the West is. It kind of, borrows loosely from one region to another. But I
Hmm.
think that a lot of the game draws upon places like Wyoming, for example, right? Like the sort of ranching country of the northern Great Plains, for example. Like South Dakota, I see as an inspiration too, especially in big disputes between Native peoples and the military. Um, yeah, the Southern Great Plains, the Texas Panhandle. I see those. I mean, the game is never explicit about what's the inspiration behind them, but
Hmm.
me as a historian, those are my kind of guesses. And obviously, the Rocky Mountains are part of that. In the game, they're called the Grizzly Mountains, so it's like a very close naming convention here.
Right. So I would love to talk about, because when you mentioned this being a college course,
That sounds
Yeah,
great.
this
definitely
book has a
something.
history. It came out of a
Yeah.
particular time and place.
Yeah. This when you mentioned this being a college course, this is something that I would have taken or tried to take had I been in school, given my previously admitted interest in this game series in particular, but just video games in general. Um, how did that? So did you created a course around this subject specifically? What was the inspiration for the
Yeah.
original idea for it?
Yeah, and when I did roll this out in 2021, it was the world's first course of its type. There's been plenty of historians who've taught using video games, and I'm sure some have used Red Dead Redemption 2 in the classroom. But as far as I can tell, no one had tried to make a class really structured around Red Dead exclusively So I'm proud to
Nice.
have the kind of Guinness Book of World Records first for that one. But yeah, so where did this come from? It's a great question. If you asked me
Yeah.
5 years ago whether I'd be teaching about video games or writing about them, I would have laughed at you. I would have thought that was totally ridiculous. But I do have a personal history. It just goes a lot deeper than that. So in the
Mhm.
1990s, and when I was growing up, when I was in high school, I was a huge gamer. It sounded a lot like you, Isaac, as you described yourself in college. I would just live and breathe in pixelated form. It was like intense. And the PC was my media. Like PC gaming was my jam.
I,
And it was
I have to ask, what were you playing before we
well,
is
what
this an
the
aside? But
real
I'm
question is
very
what
curious.
wasn't I playing at that time? But the thing is, like the late 90s, so I went to high school from 96 to 2000, and those years were a real golden era when it came to PC gaming because so many of the
Hmm.
games that people are still playing, like version 4 or 5 of, came out in that period, like Diablo, Half-Life, Quake, StarCraft, Warcraft, all of those I've played a whole lot of, to be sure.
Age of Empires. I think the first Civ was around then too. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. It was a sort of, renaissance moment, a big bang moment of PC gaming, and it did me no favors either socially or academically. And I was actually a terrible high school student. No one in 2000 would have picked
Same.
me out to be professorial material. That's for
And
sure.
now look
So
at
in
you.
fact, well, yeah,
You
exactly.
used your gaming for the better of the world. See.
But I had to quit for a long time to make that possible, right? So that's the next part of the story, which is that when I got to college in 2000, I decided pretty quickly after getting to university that I needed to quit, right? That I needed to
Mm.
focus on other parts of my life, making friends, and doing my schoolwork. And I quit in 2000, and I really stayed off of gaming for literally 20 years. Like 20 years is a
Wow.
long time. So like during
Mm.
college,
It's pretty
grad
good.
school, as an assistant professor, I really didn't look back. Like I just didn't. I assumed this was like part of my, childhood, frivolities, and this was something I grew out of. Like this was something that, I was actually kind of ashamed of it. It's not something I talked to. Like my grad school friends, they didn't know about this. Like this was not part of my identity at that time. But it was always
I'm sensing a large but or a turn in the story coming up.
there is indeed, yeah. In fact, so during these 20 years, I wasn't playing. But like every couple months, there'd be this like little devil coming up on my shoulder saying like, I bet games look so good nowadays, you should totally dive back in. Because I was always a real sucker for like the technical graphical element of games back in high school.
Hmm.
So there was that sort of like itch over these decades that I was like, oh, I should, dive back in and see what the games are like. But I resisted the urge. Like I shoved that devil off of my shoulder because I had other things going on that seemed a lot more worthy of my time until March of 2020. COVID
Oh yeah.
pandemic arrives,
Oh, there you go.
turns all of our lives upside down, and I finally begin listening to the little devil on my shoulder. In part because by 2020, I was much more established in my career. I'd earned tenure at my job, I'd published my first book. I was kind of in a good place professionally. So I decided in 2020, let's just dip my toe back in. And by this point, I have much less free time than I did in high school. I've got young kids. I'm not going to be becoming the gaming hermit that I was in 1999, right? I knew that was, well, I very
Sure.
much hoped that I wouldn't, that would be very distressing if I did. But I decided to dip my toes back in. I bought a new gaming PC early in the pandemic. Was thankful to get one of the very last ones before they all sold out in that
Right.
fateful year. And one of the very first games that I played was Red Dead Redemption 2. And
Hmm.
the reason I played it was for two reasons. One, I heard that it had great graphics. Remember, I really cared about,
Right.
the visual element here. And I was definitely not told wrong about that. This game has amazing graphics, to be sure. And the other reason I started playing it is actually a recommendation from one of my colleagues, who's a 19th
Hmm.
century Civil War era historian, who said, "Hey, Tori, check out this game." it's not stupid. That's where his 3 words. It's not stupid. And that seems like an underhanded compliment, but actually, for a professional historian talking about a historical game, that's a pretty high praise, I would say. And I think he intended it as high praise, and he likes the game, as of course I would.
Especially because his specialty is in that era
Right.
too. Like, 'cause
Exactly.
that's
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
So, yeah, I begin in, I guess, summer of 2020, begin playing Red Dead 2, and it kind of blew my mind pretty hard. In part because of graphics and the storytelling, right? The acting, the human
Mhm.
emotion in it. That's a long ways from Half-Life in 1998, right? There'd been a lot of
Right.
narrative progression in how this gaming industry tells stories. I mean, they barely even told stories at all back in the late 90s. It was pretty simplistic stuff back then. So I was impressed at the kind of, it as a video game, but about 20 hours in, which is like a quarter of the way in, right? About 20 hours into the game, that's when it struck me that, wow, my colleague is right. This is not stupid. And I remember the moment
Mhm.
when everything clicked. Like, 'cause I was playing for fun the first 20 hours. But after hour 20, I was
Sure.
like, no, I need to think about this as a professional historian. And the moment that really triggered me was when the gang leaves the West and enters the South, enters the Deep South, this
Mm.
fictional state of Lemoyne, enters what's supposed to be New Orleans. And I'm primarily trained as a Southern historian. That's where much of my
Mhm.
background comes from. I know a lot of Western history, and I've taught myself a lot of Western history for this book, for this class. But it was really when the game went south, literally, not metaphorically. The storyline only gets better as that happens. That's when I was like, wow, this is a game that so many millions of people have played. This game is really the Oregon Trail of this generation. And it's now not just speaking to Western questions, which is, of course, a very crowded cultural industry, but talking about the South in the 1890s, which is this really pivotal decade in Southern history. I'm happy to talk more about it later on. But one that doesn't capture the spotlight in the same way that, cowboys and
Right.
gunslingers has when it comes to
Right.
pop culture. And the way that the game handled the South, for the most part, was, largely thoughtful. There's exceptions, to be sure. It relies on stereotype and cliche once in a while, but there's a lot of thoughtfulness in how the game depicts questions of race and inequality and politics
Mhm.
and memory and the Civil War and all kinds of stuff in the South. So that was the moment when I was like, wait a minute. First, I wanted to see like what have other historians written about this game. So I got on to
Sure.
my usual academic databases, searched, in the Western Historical Quarterly, the Journal of Southern History, the Journal of American History, and my search came up with nothing in 2020. Like historians were just not engaging with it, at least in
Hmm.
the venues that I searched for. And this seemed like a great shame because the game, is not dumb, and there's a lot of people
Right.
playing it. So that was the very moment that I realized, why don't I try teaching a class that uses the
Hmm.
fictional content as a way to get students excited about those big, real dilemmas of violence or things that spurred violence in the kind of turn of the century period in the U.S. So I figure out I guess that, oh, I'll be like the fifth person doing this, but again, some searches on the internet confirm that no one's actually tried this before.
Well,
Huh.
it sounds like it was pretty
That's pretty.
successful. I mean, you had a lot
Yeah,
of students. Were people fighting to get in this class? I mean, I imagine it would, fill up really quickly and then you'd have a long wait list and everybody wanting to get
yeah,
in your
it did.
class.
It did exactly that. And as I was preparing for so I taught it in fall of 2021 for the first
Mhm.
time. And during that spring and summer leading up to it, I did a lot of like promotion to try to get word out, because I wanted to have a big class. I wanted to show that video games can get students to sign up for a serious history class. So I took to social media because let's remember, this is the pandemic. A lot of this campus
Yeah.
that I'm on was locked down at that time. And there was no way I was going to put up flyers in the student union. There was no one in the student union at the time. So I
Right.
took to social media. And what was really fun was that my original post went viral on Twitter and then on Reddit and got,
Hmm.
tens and tens of thousands of people around the world and hundreds of thousands. I don't know. I haven't crunched the numbers on it. Um, they were super excited about this class, right? People were really
Wow.
fired up. And I got lots and lots of messages in I should note the main reason I did this was to spread the word among UT students, right? But it ended up
Right.
being much bigger than that. And the whole, not the whole internet, but a good chunk of the internet was very excited about this idea. And I just got buried in messages of people asking, how can I take this class? Like, how can I audit this class? And I'm like, you have to be a student at UT. I'm sorry. Like, there's no workaround to this. There's no Zoom sections
You
of
gotta
this thing.
enroll.
You got to enroll,
Sorry.
exactly, which was very disappointing news to people in Turkey, China, Russia, France.
Right.
I mean, I'm telling you, I got messages from all over the world. And that, in part, is what inspired me after the class was done, come December, when I'm sitting exhausted at the end of the semester. I'm also sitting next to a big stack of lectures that I've prepared and assignments and readings and just so much intellectual work that semester. All those messages that I'd gotten earlier that year, about how can we access it, that's in part what inspired me to turn the class into a book, to take the adventure that I'd taken my class on and to put it in book form and make it digestible and accessible and fun and enlightening, hopefully, to hopefully lots of people around the world who love these games, but are also curious about the real history that's, kind of showcased, you know, on the margins of the game,
Mm-hmm.
people who might want to take that and place it at center stage.
Right.
Sure. That's fascinating. So, did you find it an effective way? Once you got into teaching the class, did you find it to be effective?
Yeah.
As
So
a
I
way
mean,
in?
it was definitely effective in just drawing students, the old butts in seats dilemma. So it
Right.
was,
Yeah. Getting them to
but then once
join.
they were there, it was also really effective in getting them to be very passionate about the material. Now, at first, I was afraid that they would be passionate, but all they'd want to do is talk about the games, right? Which would be really frustrating because ultimately this is not a class about the Red Dead games. Like there's not any quizzes or
Right.
tests on game content. I did not expect students to have played the game. I never examined them on material from the game, which is of course fictional, and this is a history class. So I was worried that, our conversations would just like devolve into Red Dead fan club. And that was something that made me quite anxious. But
Right.
that really didn't happen, in part because I guided it, as firmly as I could without being, draconian about it. But I found that the enthusiasm and passion that they had for the games would also translate into their discussions, like about real historical issues, talking about the Johnson County War in Wyoming, and about these big dilemmas of corporate capitalism on the Great Plains. They were just as excited to talk about that as they were about the Vanderlyn gang, which is not what I was expecting. But it was really, really fun to see students so eager to do the heavy lifting that I was asking them to do in class. So it was successful in that regard, to be sure.
Yeah, that's not I was expecting that answer, or that perspective, mostly because like that's kind of how I got to my interest in history was via fiction, not video games in particular, but fiction. I was like a lore nerd,
Sure.
for things like Lord of the Rings and the Song of Ice and Fire books and stuff, and then in my early 20s read 4 or 5 books on the War of the Roses because that's kind of what the basis of the George R. R. Martin structured the Game of Thrones books on. So like I followed a similar path, and I can
History has
see
a
how,
lot of
yeah.
lore.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It's the
There's a
same.
lot
It's
of.
just
I
from
think
real life.
it's a similar instinct, and it draws in particular
Yeah.
kinds of learners and particular kinds of people who crave certain types of knowledge. I think even in academic history class that's about society and politics and economics and gender and race and class, like it can draw a particular kind of learner in, which I think
Right.
maps
Right.
neatly onto that video game kind of fan base.
Huh. Well, that's cool. I'm very happy the class was successful. I'm very happy that you had the instinct to turn it into a book because I'm very excited
Well,
to engage
like
with
the
it
other thing
and
I
for the world to
do,
engage with it.
the other thing I do other than teach is I write. So it's like the one thing I know how to do, or the one of the two things that I know how to do. And what really motivated it meant a lot to me too, as I was planning this book, to have it accessible and engaging to regular non-academic readers. Because
Right.
my first book, which is an academic monograph, I'm very proud of it, but it has a very niche audience, right? It's really written for scholars, graduate students, and faculty who are,
Mm-hmm.
people who are in that field. And while I loved writing that book, I wanted to do something for my second project that was going to be something you could strike up a conversation with someone on the street about. And that was not the case for my
Right.
first project. So it was a real adventure for me trying to figure out how to write in that style, how to craft a book that would be accessible to a person who's never read a history book before. But I figured out that I really had to lean into my teaching persona, because my
Mhm.
teaching persona does know how to connect with 19-year-olds. It's what I do every single week, right? I just needed to replicate that
Right.
on the page, which was a new thing for me to try, but it was very fun.
All right. Well, I'm ready to start talking about the history behind the
Yeah.
game. Um, and one of the events that you mentioned in the book that I want to make sure we talk about is the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, which just one of those things that you wish you could step back in time and just go to that event, and then come on back. Um, so, can you talk a little bit about what it was and how it impacted the game? Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. So the World's Columbian Exposition was one of these massive world's fairs that were incredibly popular in the late 19th century. I mean, like, this is what drew big crowds. It wasn't sporting events, it wasn't cinema. It was these world's fairs, right? These demonstrations of progress and technology, and these kind of boastful declarations of why one country or another is, at the top of the heap in the global race. And probably the most impactful and significant one in American history comes in 1893 in Chicago.
Mhm.
And this is a big milestone that they're celebrating. It's the 400th anniversary of Columbus landing in the Americas. Though they clearly must have had trouble getting their stuff together, because this is 1 year after that anniversary. It's 1893, not 1892. Maybe some snafu got in the way there. But so I've claimed in my class and then in my book as well that no single event gives more shape to the storyline of Red Dead Redemption 2 than the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. And I
Hmm.
mean that for a reason. So, what I see as the main storyline of Red Dead 2 is, yes, it's about the West, but it's also about a closing West, a fading West, a West that is disappearing. And the game's basic storyline argues that that's not a good thing, right? That this sort of closing of the Western frontier is a problematic thing, that this unbounded possibility of previous decades was coming to an end. And people like Dutch van der Linde, the kind of main, intellectual figure in the gang in many ways, is consistently speaking to this, right? So, like, this is the story of the game. Where is that story coming from? Because it turns out that's a very old story. That is what Americans have been telling for more than a century before Red Dead Redemption 2 came out. And I would argue that the real genesis moment, the sort of ground zero moment where this obsession with a fading West comes, is at the 1893 World's Fair. Because there's this
Hmm.
incredibly influential speech that every American historian knows. This young professor by the name of Frederick Jackson Turner gives this lecture to a small group of people. There's like maybe 30 people in the room. It's not crowded. He does not receive a standing ovation for it, but it's going to come to be very, very influential in time. And his basic argument in that room, you can imagine this kind of stuffy, overheated room. It's late in the afternoon in July. It's not particularly
Ooh.
comfortable. I'm sure everyone's kind of like, ready to get out of their seats after sitting there all day. He gives this address called The Significance of the Frontier to American History. And he makes this kind of somewhat simple twofold argument, right? He argues that this constant process, this recurring cycle of settling Western land, called empty land, vacant land, is what made Americans who they are. What made Americans into the people that they are today, in terms of that it makes them individualistic, it makes them egalitarian, it makes them democratic, it makes them rugged. That it's this process, this cycle of of consistent westward movement that made Americans who they are, right? That, like, alternate explanations of what made America what it is, like the slavery disputes, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration, British inheritors, that's all wrong. It's these recurring cycles of westward settlement, right? So that's his first part of an argument. And then the second big part of his argument is that, well, that's all coming to an end. And he declares that 1890 was the year. 1890 was the year when the frontier closed, and that these recurring cycles are over. They're not going to be coming back. And he's very anxious about this, right? Because he kind of, the first part of his argument is like, this is what made America great. He doesn't say those words, and he has some reservations about the American character produced by this westward migration and westward settlement. But he genuinely believes that America's future is very uncertain because this period of unbounded possibility is now coming to an end. And Red Dead Redemption 2 basically takes Turner's argument and builds a game out of it, and claims that the 1890s is when the West is closing. It is when this earlier period, this old West, right, is coming to an end and something else is replacing it. And so I see that one speech, which would become incredibly influential in the decades following when Turner gave it, as in many ways the core blueprint of the game. Now that's an issue because this is a really problematic argument. It is one that
Yeah.
historians for the last 40 years have been debunking, have been showing to be complete nonsense, in part because Turner's argument of the West making American character, it's really only an argument that makes sense from a white male English speaking perspective. And that is of
Right.
course not
Mhm.
at all the entirety of who was in the West at this time at all. So it's very ethnocentric, right? It really doesn't consider things from a native perspective or from a Spanish imperial perspective, from a French perspective, from a Chinese perspective, or whatever. But the other reason why Turner's so wrong is that 1890 is not actually the perforation mark that we should use to understand Western history. Uh, there's a lot of folks who've argued that this is a singular story. There is no old West and new West. There's patterns that play out across a long period of time that can't be neatly
Mhm.
pinpointed at a particular moment as the kind of the dividing mark in that history. And I would argue that we still kind of live in a wild West or a wild America. I mean, look at the headlines of this country. It's a pretty wild place in so many ways. The homicide
Sure.
rates in many countries, many cities in this country, not all to be sure, but some, map onto these kind of wild frontier towns of California or Wyoming as well. So
Mm-hmm.
there's a long-winded way to say Frederick Jackson Turner shapes the game in many ways, but the
Mm-hmm.
game is ultimately better than Turner. They do a much better job. They don't replicate the worst
Right.
of Turner, but they do replicate the general framework of his argument.
Interesting. So, and is that like the anxiety of a changing system, a system where people have gotten used to a certain way of doing things, whether it's homesteading or sort of like free range of cowboys to do, wild cattle and all that kind of stuff, and things shifting to a more not necessarily shifting like naturally progressing to a more structured system, but just changing from what they have been, like certain dynamics shifting. Is that the
Yeah.
anxiety that's driving both Turner and what's happening in the game?
And you're absolutely right that it's anxieties that help explain why Turner's argument become so popular. Why? Because given that it's
Hmm.
mainly wrong, why then did it gain so much of a following? Well, I think you're right that it really speaks to anxieties that not all Americans had, but a particular set of Americans. And the particular set of
Sure.
Americans who really embrace Turner's explanation and give it the sort of prominence that it ends up having are Eastern well-to-do white men. And Eastern well-to-do
Huh.
white men are very powerful individuals at this point in time. I mean, they're really running the United States in so many ways. But Eastern well-to-do white men see Turner's argument as helping to make sense of these broader changes in their society. Because in their lives, they'd seen so much about culture and about their daily lives change, right? Especially as they move into cities, because a lot of well-to-do men are no longer doing the kind of muscular work that they'd been doing in the countryside. They are now sitting behind a desk. They're balancing checkbooks. They're writing reports. And a lot of these men were worried that they were losing their masculinity as a result. Right? There's this tremendous amount of anxiety in late 19th century America about American men becoming emasculated, that they were losing their manliness because they're not like, slaughtering cows. They're not, like cutting wheat in a field. They're balancing
Mm-hmm.
checkbooks and riding a trolley car and that sort of thing. And there's all these
Sure.
other anxieties that are contributing to this anxiety about masculinity. It had been by the 1890s quite a long time since the U.S. had been at war. Right, it had been about 30 years since the Civil War had come to an end, And many men at the time believed that war is what produces real masculinity among men, and that the Civil War veterans were kind of graying or dying off at that moment. So there's this whole constellation of anxieties that then brings Turner's argument in and helps to explain this even further, right? Because these men are like, wait, the West, the frontier, used to be this reservoir of masculinity that we could kind of recapture, that we could, use to as an antidote to the over civilization taking place in cities, and they were very worried, therefore, when Turner's like, yeah, well, that's come to an end, you know. And I think the single most important well-to-do white urban Eastern man who really gets behind this is Teddy Roosevelt, because Teddy Roosevelt
Mhm.
reads Turner's argument like just a few months after he gave that address. He writes fan mail to Turner and says, "You've totally nailed it. Like this is the big crisis of our age." And in his political career, Roosevelt just tries to do everything possible to kind of wedge the frontier open. He wants to prevent the West from closing. That's why he creates the national park system,
Mm.
basically a way to kind of keep this
Hmm.
reservoir of wildness open in the West. It's also part of the reason why Roosevelt wants to invade Cuba, why he's marching up San Juan Hill in 1898, because he sees Cuba and other colonies as an extension of the frontier, as a way to kind of keep
Mm.
this frontier open
Hmm.
and allow its wildness to balance out this over civilization in cities, right? So men like him could live what he called the strenuous life. So in many ways, there's like parallels between Dutch Vanderland in the game, who's also dreaming of like Tahiti and Cuba and Australia. The leader of the gang, wants to escape and find this, preservation of a frontier outside of the boundaries of the U.S. That's like classic Teddy Roosevelt in the turn of the century period.
That's such an interesting perspective on him, because we've done a few episodes on
We
Teddy
have.
on TR, and that's a great way to help explain or provide context to him cosplaying the cowboy, because
Right.
he's legitimately like a rich New
Mhm.
Yorker
Yeah, he's a total
playing the part of
poser,
a cowboy. Yeah,
But
yeah.
Teddy Roosevelt is so obsessed with American masculinity. He sees it as so vital to the future of the country. And when I say masculinity, it really is talking about white male white masculinity. Um, and he's really eager to preserve this in some way, right? And he does. I've seen photos of him putting up some outfits that would look like Arthur Morgan outfits in Red Dead Redemption 2. Like he might as well be in the character creator of this game at that point.
Yeah, and they were at photo shoots that were done in Manhattan for the most
Right,
part.
exactly. I mean, he does spend time in the Dakotas, ranching, pretending to be a cowboy, but he's doing so not because he needs to earn a living, right? He comes from this extremely wealthy family in New York, so he's there for fun, right? He's the quintessential dude. This is
Yeah.
a phrase my students don't know. Like they use that word all the time, dude. But the origins of that was an Eastern city slicker like Roosevelt, who was coming out west to try to reclaim this, fading masculinity. That's why dude ranches popped up that catered to these dudes who were generally, like made fun out of pretty savagely because they were such pompous fools in so many ways. Though, of course, this is an industry that still exists, like many of these instincts of, the West as preserving this, distant wildness as something that city people need. There's probably like a couple 100,000 people currently at this minute, in the West trying to live out these fantasies.
Well, I think as we're talking about this idea of the changing landscape and the closing west, that the Transcontinental Railroad must have had played a pretty big role in this, because when you're talking about, you're now able to travel at speeds that were impossible before. So now everything feels smaller. It's almost like, the country is shrinking because, now we can fly. And so you feel like, okay, I can get across the country, in 4 hours. And they're looking at it like that. And so I imagine that changed the landscape and also people's sort of perception of the West and probably just of the nation in general.
Yeah. And that's one of the things I really like about Red Dead Redemption 2 as well, is that there's a whole lot of railroads in the
Yeah.
game. There's just railroads in every single location, right? Like no matter where the gang runs in their flight from authority, they're still close to railroads. And they're
Nice.
also very close to railroad men, to the big industrialist bosses who ran these railroads. Indeed,
Hmm.
the sort of primary antagonist of the gang in the game is this guy, fictional guy called Leviticus Cornwall, who's clearly supposed to be a sort of, Cornelius Vanderbilt of some sort, a railroad
Mm-hmm.
tycoon who's got the Pinkertons in his pocket, who's got, governors and senators in his back pocket. And again, that's all very correct, right? I mean, big business and politics were
Yeah.
all very interconnected in Gilded Age America. So I love how the railroads are central to the game because, of course, they were so important in fueling some of those violent disputes about
Mm-hmm.
capitalism, right? I mean, we think of
Right.
railroads as these quaint, backward thing, but no, in the 1870s and 80s, they were really revolutionary and they were also very controversial, very
Mm-hmm.
unpopular in many sectors. Not that people didn't like riding on railroads or shipping their crops or goods on railroads, but they felt they were being taken advantage of by the big bosses who ran the railroads. And they were totally right. Those bosses were doing exactly that.
Yep. One of my favorite historical opinions about railroads is Thoreau. At one point, is talking. It's like just an aside, but he's talking about how people live their lives too fast, and
Yeah.
something like these days. And he's like, everybody's got to go 30 miles an hour, right? It just rings so slow to the, like if he could only live to see what it was like. But yeah, like the speed and of travel and the way goods moved around the country was genuinely
Yeah.
transformative.
Right,
It wasn't
absolutely. I mean, the speed wasn't that high, but it was just the fact that they were predictable and that didn't get slowed down
right,
by rain
Right.
and mud. And I mean, overland travel before railroads is just so slow in the United States, so slow and
right.
expensive as well.
Yeah.
So the transcontinentals, they do create reliability in over large,
Mm-hmm.
vast space. Though I should say, oftentimes we think of, the first transcontinentals as like these genius projects, that were ahead of their time. Well, they were ahead of their time, but in a bad way, in that almost no one was looking for these railroads at the time. Like there was no economic demand, or very, very little. Many of them
Mm-hmm.
were terrible business ventures. Like tons of them went bankrupt. Tons of them ended up in receivership. They might have made big fortunes for a handful of people, like Leland Stanford, who founds that big university bearing his name
Mm-hmm.
in California. But a lot of the companies are actually ruined by this. I mean, the
Mm.
Transcontinental Railroad really comes like 30 years too early. If they'd waited 30 years, it probably would have been totally fine for American history.
Hmm.
Interesting.
That's fascinating. So, well, I guess one thing that I want to touch base before we have any closing thoughts is since there is one real institution
Yeah.
that's in this, and we've mentioned them several times,
Yeah,
but Pinkerton isn't a name that's known to a lot of people these days readily.
Right.
yeah.
Do you think you could explain exactly like who they are and like how they, what purpose they serve, both historically and today?
Yeah, right. So the Pinkerton National Detective Agency was founded in the 1850s by the Scottish immigrant to the US named Alan Pinkerton. And they still exist in the 21st century. They're a shell, what they used to be sure. They're owned by a Swedish security company right now, which is quite funny. I should note that these modern day Pinkertons did not at all like their depiction in Red Dead Redemption 2. In fact, they sued the developers of the game because they claimed that this was an inaccurate portrayal of them. They lost the suit. I don't think it ever even went to court, but they're still around. But
Wow.
basically, what the Pinkerton Detective Agency is this non-state, it's an unofficial private police agency or detective agency that would get hired by big business, usually, to kind of do some of their dirty work that the regular police weren't able to do. And the Pinkerton Agency really first becomes famous in the 1870s, mainly for chasing outlaws in the West. And this clearly, shaped Rockstar's decision to include them in the narrative and to have them pursue this gang. And in the 1870s, Alan Pinkerton and his men would go after big name outlaws like Jesse James, for example, in Missouri, where he lived, and pursued a whole range of other outlaw gangs. However, so the game is correct in that, the Pinkertons were a real thing and they did pursue
Mhm.
outlaws. But where the game messes up is with the timing, because the Pinkertons were really chasing outlaw gangs in the 1870s. And Red Dead Redemption 2 is not set in the 1870s. It's set about 30 years later in
Sure.
1899.
Mhm.
And by the 1890s, the Pinkerton were still a household name, but they were mainly in the business of breaking strikes, of infiltrating labor unions, and
Right.
trying to sabotage the American labor movement in whatever way possible, right? They were the sort of private army that big businesses hired when their workers went on strike, right? So in strikes like the Homestead strike in Pennsylvania, they were just merciless in crushing striking workers. And so again, remember, Red Dead 2 doesn't talk about labor unions. However, the
Right.
Right.
Pinkertons are mainly involved with labor unions by the 1890s. Not that they weren't
Right.
hunting any outlaws, it's just that Western outlaws was not their primary focus at that point. So again, the game's timing is a bit off, and this is actually a very
Mm-hmm.
common theme in the game. I often joke that Red
Hmm.
Dead 2 is a great game about 1872. The problem is, again, it's set in 1899, a
1890.
good while later, and
That's
many
funny.
of the subjects that it captures really neatly in the game would make so much sense in an 1870s context, right? Like the Pinkertons chasing outlaws, the Ku Klux Klan, for example, which pops up in the southern portions of the game, open warfare between native nations and the U.S. military, another big part of the game. All that makes
Hmm.
so much sense in 1872 and makes zero sense in 1899 because that was just not happening by that point. And those
Right.
30 years
Hmm.
make a big difference, you know?
Right.
Hmm.
That's interesting. Yeah, and I wonder. That's a curious choice as to the timing of the setting of the
Right.
Right.
when they were taking so much inspiration from the
Well,
1870s.
Why not
I
just
really
yeah.
hope that Red Dead Redemption 3, who knows whether such a game will exist. I'm certainly not involved in making it in any way. But I'd love it if the third game continues the motion of the series backwards. Because the first game set in
Right.
1911, then the second one in 1899. I'd love a third game to be set in like 1871, and then Rockstar can finally make a game about the early 1870s that's set in the 1870s as well.
Right.
Sure.
Well,
Lynn, you're about to ask a
yeah,
question.
well, I was thinking we were talking about the West, but you had mentioned that there is some Southern stories in the game as well, and that is your
Quite a bit.
particular specialty. So, are there any Southern stories or aspects of the story that you'd like to share with us? Maybe something that was particularly accurate or inaccurate, since it's your
Yeah,
specialty that you could share.
yeah. Well, I think the examination of New Orleans is so interesting because New
Hmm.
Orleans is such a fascinating city and it's one that's
It is.
changing really rapidly in the 1890s. So I want to focus in on that.
Okay.
One of the interesting ways that the game accurately captures the kind of multicultural nature of the American population is that there's a lot of immigrants in the game. There's a lot of people who've recently arrived to the US. And again, that would be completely accurate. In fact, the foreign-born population of the US, the proportion in 1900 is higher than it is today, right? So there's a whole lot of immigrants in the US at the time. And in New Orleans, or Saint Denis, I should say, the game's fictional New Orleans, Sicilian immigrants are particularly important. And a lot of the storyline traces what's essentially this kind of Sicilian mafia in New Orleans who's running the city from the shadows, who's kind of the puppet masters. There's this mob boss by the name of Angelo Bronte who speaks good Sicilian Italian, in the game. And it portrays this very, interesting picture of New Orleans and immigrant society. Now, the question is that true or not? Right. So,
Mhm.
yes, New Orleans was home to a lot of Italians and particularly a lot of Sicilians, much more so than the rest of the country. And 90% of New Orleanian Italians were from Sicily. However,
Wow.
the fact that they were mob bosses running the city is so far from reality that it's kind of laughable. Because in fact, in the game, like the Sicilians are the sort of victimizers of the city. But in
Hmm.
reality, Sicilians were very much the victims of the city. They
Hmm.
were ostracized, they were marginalized. And in fact, one of the most infamous mass lynchings in American history takes place earlier in the 1890s and is the lynching of, I think, 11 Sicilian immigrants in New Orleans
Whoa.
because fears among the white native-born New Orleanians that there was a mafia in New Orleans and that they had killed the police chief of the city. So they'd lock up a bunch of Sicilian immigrants who had nothing to do with this murder. And then when they're found innocent, a big mob comes together and then hangs them right in front of the prison. And one of the most fascinating things about this episode is that it becomes a huge international controversy in I
Hmm.
think it's 1892,
Huh.
1893, I can't remember. and the prime minister of Italy is like freaking out, like how on earth can the US possibly kill our countrymen, with such carelessness? And
Right.
the following year, President Benjamin Harrison unveils the very first Columbus Day ever. And Columbus Day was originally meant to recognize the contributions of Italians to American society. And this was just a way to
Interesting.
paper over the
Huh.
lynching of the Sicilians in New Orleans, right, in the earlier 1890s. So the fact that the game speaks to this, but fudges a lot of it. Like
Yeah.
the game's portrayal of Sicilian immigrants is really more drawn from the sort of fevered imaginations of that mob in New Orleans than it is from
Mm-hmm.
actual reality. So it does a disservice in that sense. But it allows me the opportunity to talk about immigration, about nativism, about hostility and
Yeah.
suspicion of immigrants, all of which is, of course, still a part of American society today, just different immigrants.
That's great. I had known about the origins of Columbus Day as far as like sort of integrating the Italian story into the American
Yep.
story, but I had never didn't
It's a
understand
PR
the sort
effort.
of like the
It's just
context.
it's
Yeah,
just an attempt
that's
to
That's
to
wild.
cover
fascinating.
this really nasty moment of mass violence in New Orleans.
Th-
Wow.
It makes much more sense why it's like an official thing, right?
Right.
Versus just sort of a cultural thing that's taking place amongst Italians that live here. It's a
Oh no, it's
but that's
founded by a WASP president.
yeah, that's fascinating,
Yeah.
and cool that the game allows you to touch on
Yeah.
that. Ever so gingerly brushing against reality,
Yeah.
as it
Just
does.
just a few weeks
But
just a few
yeah,
weeks ago, actually, I got to meet the actor who played Angelo Bronte at a video game
oh,
convention. Jim Peary is his name. He's an awesome guy, really smart, thoughtful guy. But I told him this story, and he's Italian American. He was like, I had no idea. That's totally crazy.
that's
Oh,
unreal.
how
That's
cool
pretty
is
cool.
that?
Now,
Was
I had one question that I wanted to ask before we hop off, and it was about the fictionalization of the time period. Did you find that, like, as a historian, do you find it useful that it doesn't try to portray historical given that they're going to take liberties, right? Do you
Yeah.
find it useful and more functional for you in this context,
Oh, I'm
given that
so glad they
these
did
aren't
it.
real names, they're not real place?
Yeah, I think it made it so much easier to teach and write about it,
Right.
because it kind of deflects attention from the really tired debate that people have about historical video games, which is how accurate is it?
Mhm.
I'm so tired of having that conversation because gamers don't actually want accuracy. No one does because the real world is dreadfully boring and mundane and monotonous, and no one wants to play a game about it. Like war, with the
Fair
old
enough.
joke that war is like 98% diarrhea and 2% boredom or something like that. I'm
Right.
mixing up the numbers in some way, but that the reality of human existence, even at these moments that are supposedly so dramatic, is actually tremendously dull and dreary. So no one really wants accurate games in a super technical sense, and
Mhm.
too much attention has been devoted to discussing that. I'm more interested in whether a game is historically thoughtful or not. Right? I really think we should replace that word accurate with thoughtful. And to me, Red Dead Redemption 2, for the most part, is historically thoughtful, even though the names of people and places are made up, and even though the violence is completely bizarrely, overinflated. It's a game that still gestures toward and makes reference to some of the big dilemmas of that time period, right? They're usually on the sidelines, but they did so much to allow a historian like myself the opportunity to take threads from the game and weave them into a much bigger and broader narrative about the United States at this really pivotal moment. So yeah, I'm happy that they didn't include the Pinkertons, though. That one, I don't know why they didn't fictionalize that one because it got
they
them
You
in a
just
little bit
can't
of
make
just
that
had a
up,
trouble.
bone to
right? You
pick.
just can't make that up.
They just had a
Exactly.
bone to pick with the Pinkertons, I guess.
Well, there's many bones to pick with
Yeah.
them. Let's be honest.
Yeah. Um,
There's
so
there's one thing I
yeah,
wanted to
one of the things.
raise before we
Go ahead.
begin.
Yeah,
One
sure.
thing I wanted to raise before we begin wrapping up, which is the audiobook version of Red Dead's history, which I'm really
Oh.
excited and proud of because the
Hmm.
narrator of the audiobook is Roger Clark, who played Arthur Morgan in Red Dead Redemption 2.
Oh, wow.
So people who
Cool.
love the game especially, I
Mhm.
hope, are going to freak out when they can digest this book, orally with Roger, playing it in character as as he did from the game.
Uh,
So you can listen to a sample of this on the audiobook page if you go to my publisher's website for the book, and you can hear what it sounds like. But he's a much better lecturer than I am, and it's a special touch that I think makes the book even more exciting for fans of the game. And I'm so thrilled and honored to have Roger's partnership on this project.
Oh, that's awesome. I've got some Audible credits I may need to
yeah, and we'll
use on
make
the
sure
audiobook when it's
we'll make
available.
sure we put the link
Um,
too to the publisher's
Yeah.
website and to that in our show notes so that people can go and take a listen and purchase your book that will be out today. So
yeah.
Exciting day.
So yeah,
yeah,
as immersive as video games are, they sort of pale in comparison to I'm like, going out and touching grass, as people like to say on the internet. Um, and one of the things that we actually like to get recommendations from a lot of the historians that we speak to is that, as far as the content or the history that you're talking about, is there any cool place for people to go visit? Of any of the events that you featured, whether it's a spot in New Orleans that was prominently featured in the video game that's a real
yeah,
place, and they can go visit that particular
Yeah.
place.
Well, I just recently took a trip that fulfills exactly what you're talking about here. So just about 2 weeks ago, I went to Deadwood, South Dakota for a Red Dead Redemption convention that
oh
Oh
took
wow,
over this small town of Deadwood in the Black Hills of South Dakota, flooded it with about 5,000 Red Dead fans and about 20 actors from the game, including Roger Clark, Rob Wiedoff, who played John Marston, and Arthur Morgan, lots of other characters and actors from the game. And then me, I was there as the resident historian, and I gave 6
nice.
lectures at this event about Western history and about how the games can help us understand some of the real dilemmas, violent dilemmas of that place. And doing all this in Deadwood, Deadwood's the town where Wild Bill Hickok was shot. It was this mining boom
yeah, yeah, yeah.
town on land that was just then stolen, I mean, really egregiously from the Lakota Sioux in the Black
Mhm.
Hills. It was a place that exemplified so many of the Western dilemmas that the game addresses. So it was amazing to touch grass in Deadwood, South Dakota, while hanging
Mm.
out with you know, Ben Davis, who's the actor who plays Dutch Vanderland, and Roger Clark, and all these other people. Right,
It's
that was a
amazing.
very special experience for me. But yeah, so I recommend going to Deadwood, go to New
Mhm.
Orleans. I mean, those are places that seem to me as obvious inspirations behind the video game.
Sure.
And they're very touristy places that are eager to sell you T-shirts with the name of the city on it.
It-
Right. Yeah, and one of the things that we just love to convey to our audience is you're probably a good, less than a day's drive away from something cool
mhm.
historically, no matter where you are in this country. There's a lot
A
there,
lot to see.
um, so the go check it out. Deadwood, I've never been. I've never
Me
been to
neither.
either of the Dakotas. I would be eager to go check it out next opportunity.
Yeah, it was a fascinating
But
place, that's for sure.
yeah. All right, Lynn, do you have any closing thoughts?
Just this has definitely made me look at video games differently in a good way, in a very good way, because the your question of are they thoughtful versus are they accurate? I absolutely love that. And I think that
Yeah,
what you're doing is you're making people care about a history that otherwise would have been names and dates. And I think that's what
yeah,
we're all trying to do. I think that's what Isaac and I are trying to do with this and with documentaries we're working on that we're all sort of have the same goal. And I think it's great what you've been doing. And thank you for sharing it,
well,
especially the
thanks.
book. I hope that other professors will pick that up and
I
it'll
mean, here's
be,
the thing, and you get at an interesting dilemma here, which is that, well, as a trained historian, right, that we have been using pop culture in the classroom for a really long time, right? We use films, we
absolutely.
use literature, we use TV shows. But video games have been the kind of black sheep that many
Yep.
folks have tended to avoid, either because they're not gamers themselves or because they're very aware of the kind of negative stereotypes that we often associate with gaming, right? That they're
Right.
misogynist, that they're overly violent, that they can be Eurocentric, toxic in so many ways. And yeah, that's true of some games, but there's a
Hmm.
lot of new games being made that are not that. And
Right.
the kinds of people who are playing those games are so different from what the scene looked like in the 90s when I was coming of age, right? Like back then, there were a lot of, disaffected young white men. And of course, those guys are still playing video games, but there's so many women, people of color, older people
Mm-hmm.
who are also love video games. And developers are recognizing that and are crafting narratives that speak to a wider range of audiences. And I think Red Dead 2, which is, a 5-year-old game, I think it's only moving forward since then, is a perfect example of that. Yes, it's violent, but it also is thoughtful in capturing a great deal of nuance in American history. So I'm cautiously optimistic about the future of gaming as a way to reach students and readers and just the general public to think about big actual historical stuff.
And I am now too. So thank you so much for being on. And hopefully some of our listeners will feel the same as I do.
Yeah, thank you
Yeah.
guys so
Thank you
much
so
for your
much.
thoughtful questions and for having me on. It's been a real pleasure.
And
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Olsen.
is there
Go
is
ahead, Lynn.
there a place we can find you? Do you do Twitter? There are so many things now, so many blue sky. I don't even know all of
Twitter,
them
Reddit,
anymore.
Blue
So whatever
Sky.
you do, where can we see you
Yeah,
online?
find me on Instagram and TikTok. That's where the action is at.
Nice. All right.
Oh,
Twitter or X is totally fading. I'm especially after Elon Musk's recent declarations. I think I'm done with that platform. But I like Twitter and Instagram. I'm sorry, TikTok and Instagram. And I've been making a lot of videos recently to promote the book, and it's actually been a really fun experiment. So look me up. I think my name is Red Dead History or Red Dead's History on Instagram or TikTok. That's where you can find me.
Great. We'll have
sweet.
it in
We'll
the
put
show
the
notes.
links to both your accounts in the
Yep.
show notes. Yeah.
Just look below.
Thinking the same thing. And the book is available today. There's a link below to go buy it, or go to your local bookstore. Actually, preferably go to your local bookstore first and purchase it there if it's available. And then if it's not, then use
Yeah.
the link in our show notes to go purchase it. But go and get it today. It'll change the way you looked at Red Dead, even if you haven't played it, and if you will change it if you did play it. So definitely go check it out. And thank you, Dr. Olsen, for joining us today.
Such a pleasure. Thank you.